Since the 1990s, the researchers actively building artificial intelligence have published papers and given lectures stating unequivocally that their creations could eventually end human life. In 2014, theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking brought this alarm to the mainstream. He told the BBC that the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. 9 years later, Geoffrey Hinton, the researcher whose work made modern deep learning possible, resigned from Google so he could speak freely about the dangers of the systems he had spent his entire life building. You might expect a civilization receiving these warnings from its most credentialed scientific minds to pause and evaluate. Instead, the major AI labs continued their research uninterrupted, and the very architects sounding the alarm raced each other to build faster. Society didn't ignore these experts by accident. We absorbed their warnings perfectly. We just processed them as entertainment. When an existential threat is packaged as a TED Talk, a best-selling book, or a keynote speech at a high-end tech conference, it generates polite applause and knowing nods. It feels highly intellectual, but it requires zero behavioral change from the audience. While these concerns occupied newspaper front pages and dominated social media discourse, the daily operations inside companies like OpenAI, Meta, and Google DeepMind experienced absolutely no friction. We constructed an institutional filter. Our systems consume the most terrifying information available, turn it into intellectual content, and strip away any actual requirement to act. To understand why governments didn't intervene, look at this chart comparing two critical timelines. The flat, linear track represents legislative progress, the speed at which governments debate and pass laws. The aggressive vertical curve represents the scaling of AI compute cover. We call this gap regulatory lag. Take the European Union's AI Act. It took 4 years to draft and negotiate this legislation. In that exact time frame, the computing power curve above it leapt past 3 distinct generations of AI models. By the time the final document is signed, the specific technological landscape the regulators spent years studying no longer exists. Relying on traditional legislative bodies to constrain a technology scaling exponentially is mathematically flawed. That leaves the entire burden of restraint on the competing tech companies themselves. In March 2023, thousands of AI researchers and tech figures, including Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak, signed an open letter demanding a 6-month pause on training AI systems more powerful than GPT-4. Not a single major lab paused. In fact, some of the most prominent signatories immediately founded new companies and accelerated their own development of competing frontier models. This dynamic is a classic prisoner's dilemma, a game theory scenario shown here in a matrix, where two rational players choose to betray each other, even though cooperating would lead to a better outcome. Both labs have the option to either pause or build. If both labs coordinate and pause simultaneously, they maintain their exact market share while guaranteeing safety for humanity. But we operate under competitive capture. The market violently punishes hesitation. If one lab pauses and the other ships a new model, the cautious company dies. So defection becomes the only financially rational choice. They secure individual corporate survival, but sprint forward into mutual civilizational danger. The AI race isn't driven by a pure desire to build the best technology. It is a race for control, fought by executives trapped inside an incentive structure where coordination is literally impossible. In November 2022, the abstract math became a consumer product. With the launch of ChatGPT, anyone with a browser suddenly had a highly accessible user interface for the systems the experts had been warning about. The researchers had hoped for a global conversation about alignment, the science of ensuring advanced systems share human values, and strict governance frameworks. Instead, the public conversation immediately shrank to the immediate conveniences of the office. Millions debated drafting cover letters, writing polite emails, or automating data entry. We took a 30-year scientific consensus about civilizational risk and reduced it to a cultural debate about office efficiency. That gap between what the experts said and what the public heard is why our policy response has entirely failed. While the public was distracted by productivity hacks, the actual risks specified by the safety researchers began deploying quietly in the background. The harm didn't arrive as a dramatic sci-fi event. It arrived as deepfake technology fabricating evidence in courtrooms and algorithmic bias deciding who gets approved for a mortgage or what diagnosis a patient receives in a hospital. This map visualizes documented incidents of AI-related harm. Notice that the clusters don't land evenly. The errors of these autonomous systems disproportionately impact low-income regions and marginalized communities, populations that lack the institutional power or capital to fight back. It leaves the experts in the position of Cassandra from Greek mythology. They possessed perfect foresight, and their warnings were believed by those in power. They simply lacked the structural mechanisms to stop what was coming. These warnings were never meant for you, the individual consumer. They were addressed to institutions that proved structurally incapable of acting. The defining challenge of the next 30 years is not whether we will build more powerful AI. We will.
The challenge is whether we can build the institutions capable of governing it before the technology makes governance impossible.